Born into royalty but cursed from the very start, Maria Antonia of Austria was a tragic product of generation after generation of relentless inbreeding. At just 16 years old, she found herself trapped in a cold and loveless marriage, and was subsequently haunted by a string of tragic pregnancies. Misery followed her like a shadow, and misfortune clung to her every step throughout her short life. But was she truly cursed by fate, or was she paying the price for something far more sinister involving her family's obsession with blood purity? Maria Antonia of Austria was born on the 18th of January, 1669, in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the grand capital of the Austrian Empire. Her father was Leopold I, an incredibly powerful man who held the titles of Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, King of Croatia, and King of Bohemia. Her mother was Margaret Theresa of Spain, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. As you may or may not be aware, both of Maria Antonia's parents were members of the mighty House of Habsburg, a dynasty that had conquered and dominated much of Europe, not necessarily through the violence of war, but thanks to highly strategic marriages and a significant stroke of luck. The House of Habsburg had established royal lines in both Spain and Austria, and these two branches had been intermarrying since the early 1500s to keep their territories within the family. However, as time passed, their obsession with maintaining absolute power turned into something far more twisted and biologically dangerous. They weren't just marrying distant relatives, they took the practice to dangerous extremes. We are talking about second cousins, first cousins, and even frequent unions between uncles and nieces. These centuries of relentless inbreeding culminated in the person of Maria Antonia. Then, to make matters even worse for the young princess, her mother, Margaret Theresa, a frail and sickly woman, died in March of 1673 at just 21 years old. The years of inbreeding had clearly taken their toll on her mother. Like so many Habsburgs before her, she was physically weak and plagued by poor health until her final breath. Maria Antonia was left motherless at just 4 years old. As the only surviving child of her parents' union, she was suddenly thrust into a very precarious political position. She was a potential heir to the Archduchy of Austria, but that claim was only valid until her father remarried and produced a male heir. At that time, Austria had never been ruled by a woman, and no one was certain if the law would even allow a female to sit on the throne. If Leopold had died unexpectedly during this period, it was unclear if the nobles would accept a female ruler or if Austria would plunge into total chaos. Beyond Austria, Maria Antonia also held a strong claim as the successor to the Spanish throne, placing her at the dead center of one of the most powerful and unstable dynasties in all of Europe. While Maria Antonia might have been the most inbred Habsburg on paper, it was her uncle Carlos, known to history as Charles II of Spain, who suffered the most visible physical consequences. From the moment he was born, his body was failing. He suffered from a horrifying array of health issues, including intellectual disabilities, skeletal deformities that left him barely able to walk, and a body that aged far too quickly, leading to early onset dementia. He also possessed the most infamous trait of the family, the monstrous Habsburg jaw, which was so severely deformed that he could barely chew his own food. Charles had inherited the Spanish throne in 1665, just before his 4th birthday. However, he would never be truly capable of ruling by himself, constantly requiring advisors and proxies to rule on his behalf. As a result, the courts of Europe were constantly buzzing with talk regarding the succession. With her mother's death in 1673, Maria Antonia became the legitimate heir to her uncle, King Charles II. Though she was just a child, Charles's frail health and disabilities left many to wonder if he would ever be able to father an heir of his own. This made Maria Antonia the presumed future Queen of Spain, destined to inherit not just the throne in Madrid, but a vast empire stretching across Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines. Given Charles's rapidly deteriorating condition, many expected that day to come much sooner than anticipated. Consequently, Maria Antonia lived her entire life under a metaphorical microscope. Foreign diplomats scrutinized her every action when they visited the court at Vienna, and her father worked tirelessly to promote the idea that she would eventually succeed Charles. This resulted in a massive wave of Habsburg propaganda. Maria Antonia sat for numerous portraits in her youth, which was a common practice for royals, but her father used these paintings specifically to promote her claim to Spain. He sent these portraits across Europe and directly to the Spanish court to make her visible to the people and solidify her royal status. This was deemed necessary because she was a woman. Had there been a male heir living in Vienna, such propaganda efforts would have been unnecessary. But the fear of female rule ran deep, and the idea of a woman inheriting the world's largest empire was enough to send shockwaves through the courts of the great powers. As Maria Antonia grew up in the city of Vienna, she remained largely blissfully unaware of the political storm brewing around her. While the leaders of Europe debated her fate, she was raised like any other highborn Habsburg princess, wrapped in stifling courtly formality and surrounded by attendants who catered to her every whim. Her education was typical for a royal woman of the era, focusing on Latin, French, music, and the basic elements of a humanist curriculum. Those who met her during this time described her as quiet and serious, yet notably intelligent and distinguished in her bearing. However, after her mother's death, her life became even more rigid. She did, however, experience a quick succession of stepmothers. Within months of his first wife's passing, Leopold married his second cousin, Archduchess Claudia Felicitas of Austria. Maria Antonia reportedly had a good and close relationship with her first stepmother, but Claudia also died young in 1676 from tuberculosis. Leopold then married a third wife, a German noblewoman who was also his second cousin, Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg. She and Leopold would go on to have 10 children together. This meant that almost every year, Maria Antonia would be presented with a new half-sibling. When a boy named Joseph was finally born from this third marriage in 1678, it provided a male heir for Leopold's Austrian titles. Now, Maria Antonia was only the heir to the Spanish throne, though the question of whether she would actually be allowed to succeed Charles in Madrid remained highly problematic. Of course, there was always another possibility in her father's mind. Maria Antonia could produce a son of her own, a Habsburg prince who would be the perfect male heir to claim the Spanish crown. Her father, ever the cold strategist, was already plotting this future while she was still just a young child, knowing that a male successor could secure Spain for their specific bloodline once and for all. To secure this future, Leopold made a shocking proposal. He intended to marry his then 6-year-old daughter, Maria Antonia, to her own uncle, the 13-year-old Charles II of Spain. Even in a family notorious for incestuous unions, this match was surprising to outsiders. It wasn't just because they were uncle and niece, but because neither was remotely ready for the realities of marriage. Charles had not even reached puberty, and Maria was far too young to bear the children the empire so desperately needed. Despite the biological hurdles, their engagement was formally announced in 1676, and a proxy wedding was planned for December. But at the last moment, the arrangement fell apart. The following year, Charles informed Leopold that he could not go through with it. Spain needed an heir immediately, and his niece was simply too young to provide one. In the end, Charles II married Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1679, seemingly closing the door on Maria Antonia's chance to become the Queen of Spain. In its place, a new plan emerged for her hand. She was suggested as a match for Victor Amadeus II, the young Duke of Savoy, but this marriage never materialized. Instead, in 1685, Maria Antonia was wed to her second cousin, Maximilian II Emmanuel, the Prince-Elector of Bavaria. At just 16 years old, she left her home in Vienna for Munich to begin a new life with her husband. Before long, Maximilian was appointed as the governor of the Spanish Netherlands, and the couple moved to Brussels. In both Munich and Brussels, Maria Antonia was immensely unhappy. On the surface, the match was not a bad one politically. Maximilian was only a few years older than her, and they were distant enough relatives to somewhat lessen the extreme Habsburg inbreeding. However, there were deep personal problems. He was a social extrovert who loved the spotlight, while she was a studious, quiet introvert who genuinely disliked court ceremonies. Maximilian often treated her with total disregard. One contemporary even referred to him as possessing one of the most perverse minds and hearts one could imagine. He wasted no time betraying his young wife, openly parading his mistresses in front of her while Maria Antonia endured the cold, loveless marriage she had been forced into. Yet her greatest suffering did not come from her unfaithful husband, but from her own cursed bloodline. Like so many of her tragically inbred ancestors, she struggled immensely with pregnancy. She lost 2 sons at birth in 1689 and 1690. By 1691, Maria Antonia had reached her breaking point. Pregnant once more and unwilling to endure further humiliations from Maximilian, she fled back to the safety of Vienna, leaving her faithless husband behind. Rumors swirled through Europe that she had no intention of ever returning to him. Then, in October of 1692, against all the genetic odds, she gave birth to a healthy son named Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. This was the child who could potentially change the entire course of European history. But Maria Antonia's personal battle for survival was far from over. The Spanish court erupted with joy at the birth of Joseph Ferdinand, seeing him as the long-awaited heir to the empire. But this moment of political triumph came at a devastating personal cost. Maria Antonia began suffering from a postpartum infection. Today, such a condition could be easily cured with basic antibiotics, but in the 17th century, there was no such salvation. The body either fought the infection off or succumbed to it. As the weeks passed, her fever raged and her strength slowly faded away. By December, it was clear to everyone at court that she was losing the battle. On Christmas Eve of 1692, at just 23 years old, Maria Antonia took her final breath. She left behind her infant son, Joseph Ferdinand, who became the fragile hope for Spain's future. But with his succession still legally uncertain, the great powers of Europe were already watching and waiting to see what would happen next. Maria Antonia's death cast wide open the issue of the Spanish succession. It was clear by then that her uncle Charles could not have children, and his health was in a dreadful state. Contemporaries expected him to die every single year throughout the 1690s, though he managed to struggle on until late 1700. In the years following her death, the Austrian Habsburgs fought fiercely to cement their claim to the Spanish throne, arguing that Maria Antonia's son was the rightful heir. After all, he was the great-grandson of King Philip IV, making his bloodline one of the strongest ties to the fading dynasty. However, the French royal House of Bourbon also had a claim. Philip IV's daughter, Maria Theresa, had married Louis XIV of France, and one of their grandchildren was a boy named Philip. He might have been overlooked entirely if not for another tragedy. In 1699, Maria Antonia's only surviving son, Joseph Ferdinand, died of smallpox, the deadliest disease of the era. With his death, the Austrian Habsburgs' direct claim through Maria Antonia crumbled. When King Charles II eventually died childless on November 1, 1700, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty officially came to an end. On his deathbed, Charles made the fateful decision to name the French candidate, Philip, as his heir. This sparked outrage across the continent. The Austrians, backed by England and the Dutch, refused to accept a French-controlled Spain. Within months, the continent was engulfed in the brutal War of the Spanish Succession, a 13-year struggle that drew in nearly every major European power. In the end, the French candidate prevailed and became Philip V of Spain, but with the condition that Spain and France could never be united under a single crown. Had Maria Antonia or her son lived, the succession might have been far less chaotic, and the map of history might look very different today. Thank you so much to everyone for watching this video on Maria Antonia, the most inbred Habsburg. I hope you found her tragic story interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please share them. I hope you are all subscribed and have your notifications turned on. That is all from me for now. I will see you all again in the next video.